good evening. Welcome to this evening's Institute of Historical Research, Transport and Mobility History seminar. It's lovely to have you all along. My name is Mike Esbester and I'm one of the co-conveners. I'll be chairing this evening, and Lewis Smith is doing the technical bits and pieces for us this evening, so thanks very much to Lewis. Just a quick note before we get started that as the previous sessions that we've recorded are available on the IHR's YouTube channel. So if you have missed any of the sessions, do please have a look for those there. And generally we try to circulate details about those recordings through the usual sorts of channels. And we'll continue to do so, including after this recording is available. Our next session is on the 27th of April. And that will be David Schley from Hong Kong Baptist University, University of East Anglia, on Relieving Broadway, the Politics of Traffic in 19th Century New York. And Lewis just popped the booking link in the chat for you. Quick note about that, the start time is the normal start time of 5:30. The booking page at the moment shows 5 p.m, but it is 5:30 start, and we will have that amended as soon as we can. Tonight, however, we are going to hear from Charlotte Mathieson. It's a great pleasure to introduce you to her, although I don't think she'll need tons of introduction, as she should be a familiar face to those regular attenders, as she's one of our co-conveners for the seminar series. In her day job, she is a senior lecturer in 19th century English literature at the University of Surrey, with a particular interest in transport and mobility in the mid-19th century novel, and those interests I think are extending further, as we're going to hear. She is the author of Mobility in a Victorian Novel and has put together a number of edited collections, including Mobilities, Literature, Culture, which was published in 2019. And she co-edits the Paul Grove Studies in Mobilities, Literature and Culture series. At the moment, she is a British Academy mid-career fellow looking at cultures of sun tanning in late 19th to mid 20th century Britain. It's a very new project. But tonight, she'll be speaking to us on Close Contact, Skin and the Space of the 19th Century Omnibus. Can I ask everyone before Charlotte starts, just if you can remain muted throughout, we will take questions at the end. You all know where the chat function is and so on. So with no further ado, Charlotte, over to you.
Thank you so much. Okay, I'm just going to do the awkward screen share moment. Hopefully that is displaying okay. Okay, great. Thank you very much. And yeah, it's really nice after all these years of being on the other side of the scenes to be on this side of the screen, although a little odd. I do feel like I should be doing something other than presenting, but here we are, and looking forward to talking to you all this evening about skin in the space of the omnibus. So in this paper, I'm just really going to offer some brief reflections upon reading transport and mobility histories through the lens of the skin as it features in literary and visual representations of 19th century horse-drawn omnibuses in London. Amid a wider critical attention to embodied experiences of travel, the outermost surface of the body, a site of visual, tactile, sensory and socio-cultural encounter, offers potential for reading and rereading bodily, social and spatial interactions of transport spaces. To contextualise the quite specific focus of what I'm presenting today, this paper is based upon a piece that I was asked to write, a short commentary on the theme of public transport as public space in urban environments. And combining my two interests in skin studies and mobility studies, I chose to kind of bring these together to think about a single mode of public transport, the 19th century London omnibus, just focusing within the confines of London. And of course, that could extend outwards. But just to think about the possibilities that a skin-centered reading about the themes of public transport space. So there are, of course, many possible avenues. These frameworks and ideas can be deployed with due historical critical awareness in many other contexts of transport, space and time. But at the same time, as I think will unfold throughout, I think there are features of the omnibus as transport space that make it particularly ripe for such a reading, that lend distinctness to the kinds of skin representations that can arise therein. Rereading the omnibus through this lens, I hope, contributes to and extends some of the arguments around its nature as a quite distinctive space, And I hope maybe brings out a few new threads in the sources that I'm just going to suggest in this paper. And there's obviously much more to be said, and really this is hopefully just some interesting propositions on the theme. The core of this paper then is on its way to publication. The wider frameworks, though, are ones that I am continuing to develop in the work of my current BA fellowship, for which I really gratefully acknowledge the funding and the opportunity to do so. And while that's on the cultures of sun tanning in literary, medical and commercial contexts, around those kind of specificities of sun tanning, there's contexts of skin mobilities, historically and theoretically, which I'm going to say a bit about at the beginning, the commercial sphere of skincare that I'll draw out towards the end briefly, thinking about the sort of networks and mobilities of skincare, as well as bodies and skins in dialogue with one another. Currently trying to tease out a bit of a thread around skincare products and commercialization and networks and movements of travel. So I'll touch on that a little bit towards the end, only quite briefly within the space of what we're looking at today. So I'm going to start by looking at the sort of just a brief bit of sort of orientation on skin mobilities, and then think about close contact in the space of the omnibus in terms of sensing, gazing, touching, and culturing skin. So transport and mobility scholars, and I feel I'm sort of speaking mostly to a transport audience, although some of you will be perhaps less familiar, and I'm going to sort of introduce the skin contexts in a moment in a bit more detail. But broadly, my work really orients within the kind of embodied experience of travel, and thinking about how bodies move through space, leave traces and changes upon the space that they move through, thinking about how mobility changes the body is a place that sort of becomes shaped through its travel, and how the embodying of class, race and gender and sexuality and other factors besides influences and impacts upon who can access what mobility and how it is experienced along the way. And that's very much the genesis of my own corporeal mobilities explorations in the Victorian novel, looking at the kind of bodily interactions with space that have now extended more directly to skin. Early manifestations of, say, sensory geography, as in Paul Rodaway's work, looked and kind of initiated some discussion of the role of the skin in the body's haptic navigation of space and geographies, and studies of the racialized politics of mobility have also, of course, thought about racial inequalities of an access to movement and within transport networks, and the intersections of race and the experience of mobility as well. So there's kind of those precursors and sort of establishing foundations in terms of mobility in the body. In recent years, coterminous with the rise of skin studies, and I'll discuss that in a moment, we've seen scholars, including myself, making more kind of conscious engagement between the two fields. Emma Vaughan's work has been really formative in establishing the skin as a site of mobile knowledge and thinking about identity transformation and agency through the skin. In 19th century studies, Ariane Duval's work, very recent essay published just last week, initiates a really evocative exploration of travelling skin in the 19th century, thinking about skin movement, horse riding, railway compartments, and the different forms of skin. And I'll be quoting that a little bit later as well. And then my own work has moved from thinking about the body in various forms to thinking very consciously about the sun tanning as a sort of material practice and process of mobility of the skin and of the body itself. So I'm just going to give a brief sort of orientation in terms of the cultural histories of skin and the sort of theoretical impulses and what we mean when we talk about skin, for those of you who might be less familiar with these contexts. A theorized kind of cultural history of the skin as symbolic surface between self and world was established in some formative works in the sort of early 2000s, such as Claudia Bentian's Skin on the Cultural Border Between Self and World. And in this, Bentian poses that the skin marks not only an actual but also a profoundly symbolic boundary that is subject to cultural and historical change, both an organic and an imaginary reality. It's explored as the meeting point of the physical and socio-cultural, the interior self and the perceiving world beyond. As Stephen Connor further writes in his foundational work, The Book of Skin, it is not only individual psychological life, but also cultural life that is lived at the level of and through the intercession of the skin and its many actual and imaginary doublings and multiplications. The skin is intricately bound up then with the formation of the internal consciousness and the process that sits between physical and psychic, subjective and objective perception. The skin borders the self, marking and containing the outer limits of the body self as both integrally complete and distinct from the world around it. Its border properties are fundamentally affective. As Ahmed posits, it's a border that feels, a medium through which sensory perceptions are integrally bound up in the formation of self, as well as through which the self is afforded, as Ahmed writes, an effective opening out of bodies to other bodies through the medium of touch. So we're thinking about the ways in which the skin sort of sits both between self and other, the ways in which the skin's sort of physicality interacts with the conceptual and the socio-cultural meanings that it's constructed through, and the ways in which these come together also to form the skin ego and the sort of sense of self that's bound up through and within the skin. During the 19th century, the matter of skin came into new prominence. A growing number of publications appeared from the 1820s onwards, continuing into the mid and later decades of the century. And among the most significant of these was Erasmus Wilson's practical treatise on healthy skin, which went through multiple editions in the UK and USA until the 1870s. And we can see from these illustrations that new understandings of the skin's form were rapidly evolving in dialogue with scientific advances and technologies. Asmianeke Tehenepi has explored microscopic examinations, visually exposed the interior of the skin to give, as she writes, a picture of an organ that harboured multiple active structures, articulating a thicker skin, a more complex skin structure. Ariane Duval has further observed the significance of this layered cross-sectional image of the skin that gained wide cultural currency through its inclusion in Wilson's popular practical treatise. Such was the continual reproduction of this text throughout the century that, as she writes, most literate Victorians would have been familiar with the image of the magnified cut through the skin's layers. So through these inquiries, the skin is gaining depth, complexity, becoming a space within itself. And that image and that popular image is being then sort of percolating throughout Victorian culture more widely through these publications. And there's a more sort of conscious thinking about and understanding of the skin. And as I've written in the article I previously cited of my own work, through dermatological writings, the skin surfaces are also gaining a very textured geography, ridges and furrows, webs, prominences. We can see these really illustrative pictures in terms of the sort of networks of the skin and the ways in which the skin is being kind of almost geographically textured through these writings. These specialist writings refracted into a wider culture of skin knowledge, and many popular publications details the care and maintenance of the skin, as well as cosmetic products to refine and improve the complexion, of which there were many. And that's something I've explored a lot of in my work on sun tanning. More widely, an array of cultural texts reflected upon the meanings of skin as well. And for 19th century writers, new dermatological understandings of the skin were coterminous with deeper conceptual questions about the status and the role of the skin in relation to the self. Contextualized by materialist inquiries that, as William Cohen has shown, attempted to locate a unique essence of the human in the physical existence of the body, Pamela Gilbert, in her Foundational Victorian Skin, has explored how the era's discussion about self and the nature of the human self and its material constitution played out through the evolution of a surface self. For Victorians, she writes, the skin was a text to be read, a medium for the expression and interpretation of interiority. No longer simply a wrapping, it became a substance integral to and having a creative role in the generation of the self. By the 1830s, the body surface was not only expressive of selfhood, but increasingly understood as constitutive of it. This integral relationship between self and skin is one that I really want to emphasize, that the self is very much bound up within the skin. The skin is not just the boundary or the sort of surface layer, but there's a much more deeply intertwined understanding of skin and self evolving throughout the period. And that becomes significant when we think then about what happens to skin when it moves into its various states and is exposed to various conditions and environments. Tactile studies have also identified the importance of touch in this period. Heather Tilley writes that understanding of the tactile sense became crucial to the ways in which Victorians conceived of reality, and touch, increasingly delineated as both a passive and active sense, became imbued with new social, psychological and emotional resonances. Touch goes deeper than the skin. It presses through and into the underlying tissues and structures of the body. But the skin surface is nonetheless inextricably interconnected in the sensation and mediation of that experience. And as a sort of first sight of sensation. And we'll see later a moment of really interesting touch and pressure becoming an important site of sort of situating the body within its context. So from that sort of brief overview of a few of the contexts of skin and why it's becoming so important at this moment throughout the 19th century, I'm just going to turn first of all to George William Joy's The Bayswater Omnibus, and just segue into thinking about skin on the omnibus and skin mobilities through a quick sort of run through of the many skin themes that this painting very nicely unfolds and encapsulates for us. I'm going to return to this painting a few times throughout. So leading on from this point about thinking about touch and the sort of the pressure and the contact through the skin, we might note that we've got a sort of a skin that is covered and concealed. So when we're talking about skin, it's not always bare skin. There's very little bare skin in the Victorian sort of visual experience. But we might think about the sensation of skin that is experienced beneath the clothing. And that's something I'll go back to later on. And obviously we can see a lot of clothing in this picture. We do have, though, some skin that is revealed and exposed, affording the subject to sensory mediation of the environment and the surrounding elements, the sensations of the air, heat, and so on that are felt on the face and the bare hands where they are exposed. Exposed skin has the possibility of absorbing and accumulating dirt and other substances from within the space as well. The wear and tear of travel might mark the skin. It can become bruised, scratched, scuffed, wounded through the process of travel and the things it comes into contact with. Skin may also leave its mark on the space itself. It has the potential to flake and peel from the body and implicitly leaves traces of itself in dust and the almost invisible fragments that are constantly shedding from the renewing skin. I haven't found any representations that do depict this, but I'm writing elsewhere about peeling sunburned skin, and I can't just help keep thinking about coming back to the kind of skin that we leave behind and the way in which that is a sort of form of space-making practice of the body as well. Skin holds the possibility of direct and likely transgressive skin-to-skin touch between passengers, as well as I've said, the haptic feeling of contact with others or the surroundings, such as the seats. The skin that's exposed opens itself up as well to gazing, so the sight on which the gaze of the others may look upon the skin, offering the potential to be read or misread. And skin is, of course, socially and culturally constituted through discourses that make meaning of class, gender, race, and other social codes and hierarchies that may be read into and played out through the skin according to its specific context, as well as how that experience is on each individual's passenger's experience of their own journey. And then skin culture permeates in the visual field surrounding the passengers through the form of the advertisements above. And we're going to look at those a bit later, and particularly the Pears soaps advertisements that are visible, but it might also be suggested that through the window view of the trees and the sense of a healthy open air scene, we have a kind of resonance with contemporary discourses of health and the body, and the sense of sort of openness and expanse of fresh, healthy air that's sort of posed beyond the window. So from these initial reflections, let's get into a few more detailed thoughts on the omnibus. So amid the range of transport spaces that the 19th century passenger found themselves within, from the more familiar forms of horse-drawn transportation to the new technological experiences afforded by the railway, the omnibus both resonates with and sits as distinct from these other modes and spaces in the physical and social experience, the individual passenger community, and other features that have brought into sharp relief within its distinctive space and time. Having originated in Paris, in 1819 and spreading to European cities, including London in 1829 with the introduction of Schiller-Beer's omnibuses. These large horse-drawn vehicles accommodating up to around 22 passengers, depending a little bit on the distinct architecture of each design. Omnibuses became a convenient, popular and relatively affordable, certainly for the middle classes, mode of urban transportation. And new operators, service lines and developments in carriage construction appeared throughout the century. I'm keeping this introduction deliberately brief because, as I'm sure many of you will remember, Richard Dennis gave an excellent paper at this seminar in 2021 on the subject of moving through space on London horse buses 1829 to 1914. And it's a fascinating, engaging and richly detailed history. And not only will many of you remember it, but if you didn't see it, it is, as with all of our seminars, available to watch on the IHR YouTube channel. Very easily found by Googling. I'm just going to make note of a few kind of key details here of omnibus time and space and a few others that will come out throughout the discussion. In particular, omnibuses were characterised by traversing set routes along which passengers could board and alight at frequent stops, bringing people together for, as Jennifer Turney notes in her essay on the omnibus and the shaping of the urban quotidian, bringing people together for sustained and yet unscripted periods of time. Nicholas Daly further notes in The Demographic Imagination that while coach journeys had similarly created shared mobile interiors, he writes there was a quality of brevity, hurry and randomness to the omnibus journey that was quite different. The result, as Charles Dickens notes, was the kaleidoscope of changing figures within the carriage. Sameness there can never be. I would further suggest that this quality of brevity is one feature that affords both character and skin depictions, a distinctness among other forms of enclosed transport representations, quick, hurried interactions that depend upon a fleeting glimpse, a momentary judgment or interpretation and impression. And the skin appears, as in a kaleidoscope, as this little fleck kind of coming into focus amid a much wider big picture, and then often shifting out of focus again, but still implicitly being there. Outside seating on the omnibus was provided first on the through the introduction of the knife board and later garden seat designs. We have in this illustration the knife board design, in this photograph, the knife board design showing the especially close proximity between passengers who were seated very closely and back to back with one another alongside the single long ways running bench. Both knife board and garden designs brought the benefits of the view and either the benefit or trial of open air exposure as opposed to the interior, which we will see in a minute. In his Indian Eye on English Life, Behramji Malabari reflects upon the top view. When tired, you may mount the top of an omnibus and from your perch look down upon rank fashion beauty all at your feet. It is delicious on a clear day. One feels as if he would never tire of riding out. From the top of the bus, you often look down upon the whole world at your feet. So it's a similar image to Dickens's kaleidoscope, but focused on the spectacle of the view from the outside. The space inside saw passengers seated along two parallel inward-facing rows of seating. And here passengers were not separated into class sections, but rather all occupied the same space. And although costs were initially prohibitive to working classes, the increasing to an extent affordability of services throughout the century was such that gradually a mix of classes became situated within this same confined space. Wilkie Collins notes in his 1852 reflection in Basel, omnibus has always appeared to me to be a perambulatory exhibition room of the eccentricities of human nature. I know not any other sphere in which persons of all classes and all temperaments are so oddly collected together and so immediately contrasted and confronted with each other. The interior inward-facing seating, Masha Belenki notes, engendered, she writes, unprecedented forms of sociability among different people, or perhaps, as Elizabeth Mann terms it, close and often awkward contact. So given these close conditions, it's not surprising that issues around bodily proximity and contact come to the fore of many contemporaneous commentaries. And Nicholas Daly terms the enforced tactile, visual and olfactory intimacy of the interior space. And so to start with the kind of wider sensory landscape, we gain a very visceral sense of the potential for contagion and transmission with all manner of unwanted substances and substances appearing within the compartment. So fear of potential contamination might include both the possibility of kind of directly becoming dirty, as well as concerns around airborne contagion and transmission. In Mary Elizabeth Braddon's The Levels of Arden, Braddon gently jests at this and the exaggerated concerns of how the young mother had a horror of omnibuses in which she supposed smallpox and fever to be continually raging. George Augustus Sala is more specific in identifying the problems of ventilation that might spread infection, the windows being sort of pulled up or down. If they're fixed, there's too much heat, and yet unpleasant persons might insist upon pulling the windows up and down, bringing colds, catarrhs, stiff necks, and so on to the scene. But open windows could perhaps improve the olfactory experience because the straw on the floor, on the apartment floor, would become musty and reeking with umbrella droppings. Flea-infested cushions and padded walls exhale this abominable odour. The filthy, glimmering, spluttering lamp lit at night with its horrible skin filling the omnibus, like an Eskimo kraal in blubber boiling time, he writes. And Edmund Yates notes a little bit later how a piece of coconut matting is gradually generally substituted at this later point for the dank straw, which he wrote smelt so horribly and clung to your boots with such vicious perseverance. A really nice sense of the omnibus space clinging to the passenger and perhaps being taken beyond the compartment. So a nice sense of contact between body and space. We might further infer that while these are not sort of directly intruding upon the skin, these spluttering and dripping sort of manifestations represent a threat to the clean-dressed and clean-skinned body of the passenger. There's a sort of sense of the wider sensory landscape as a potential possible intrusive threat upon the body. Indeed, inside, the passenger did not have much space in which to maintain their cleanliness, and issues of bodily proximity start to move us in a bit closer towards the skin by thinking about the sort of space and the way the body is oriented. So pieces in the periodical press discuss appropriate spatial etiquette and conduct. An 1836 guide to omnibus behaviour in the Times includes the advice to sit with the limbs straight and do not let your legs describe an angle of 45, thereby occupying the room of two persons. Among various other sensory considerations of space, sound and bodily fluids that are covered throughout this passage. No spitting is noted. The squeezing, crushing conditions of the space are similarly noted again in Malabari, thinking about the sort of he sees half a dozen women rushing into the omnibus, squeezing themselves into their seats. He squeezed between two of the prettiest and quietest, feeling a strange discomfort. I feel my fair neighbours knocking against me at every moment. They do not seem to mind it at all. It is a matter of course. And in an article calling for improvements in omnibus conditions, an anonymous author in the piece, Will the Public Strike? And the strike here proposed is an omnibus strike to improve conditions. He makes note of suggestions such as increasing the width of the inner aisle so as to avoid the vicious struggle and leg conflict which goes on in that arena on each side of the modern omnibus, the vast deal of squeezing and crushing. These bodies are being squeezed, crushed and knocked against, not only contending with one another, but also sort of sitting within a very confined scene. And so here we have a sort of more general sense of the body being squeezed and crushed. We're not quite yet at the skin, but we've got a sense of the sort of the filling of the scene with the profusion of bodies. Indeed, as I've suggested already with George William Joy's painting and exaggerated here in Egley's, is that we've got the scene filled not so much with the passengers themselves, but with the layers of clothing and the accompanying things of travel, coats and cloaks, gloves and hats, baskets and umbrellas, babies bundled in blankets, filling this bustling scene that's replete with textiles and textures, and a very textured scene within which these passengers sit. Edmund Yates's description on an omnibus in All the Year Round notes how the new arrival into the omnibus has to grope his way through a brushwood of crinolines and use umbrellas to finally squeeze himself into the space between the woodwork and his neighbour's shoulder. Such scenes and this sort of the filling of the textural scene accord with my own earlier discussion in the context of the railway, where I look at travellers wrapped up in railway rugs and enveloped in thick layers of clothing, and how the sense of sort of protection psychologically afforded to the traveller through the upholstered comforts of travel, sort of cushions and surrounds. And I think in the omnibus, we might say that these layers of clothing afford a very practical cushioning against the struggle and leg conflict that we've seen, the squeezing and crushing, at the same time as they further limit the available space. Furthermore, and as Ariane de Waal pertinently notes in her recent essay on skin exposure and skin friction, in the recently published essay on exposure, friction and peculiar feeling and mobile skin, de Waal notes that even when wrapped up in this way, writers were still suggestive about the skin beneath the clothing. And discussing writer Foxwell, she notes that an emphasis on a constant rubbing against one another in stations, on platforms and in train compartments highlights the involvement and activation of passengers' skin, even as it's situated beneath and shrouded within layers of clothing. The skin beneath still feels the pressure, the contact, the rubbing motion of the clothing against its body that is impacted by and stimulated into motion through all of this surface action that is acting upon it. Indeed, we see that even when skin is shrouded beneath layers of clothing, its surface might still be susceptible. In his call for the omnibus revolution, Sala proclaims, "We wish to render things of the past, all the corn crushing, rib bruising, boot soiling, skirt tearing, eye by umbrella for real endangering, temper exacerbating and grumbling," presenting the skin surface as vulnerable to becoming here crushed, bruised, and even posing the eye as a susceptible entry point into the body. So clothing might cover the body, but the skin beneath is still vulnerable to these different forms of injury and penetration. Clothing is fallible; it becomes soiled and torn. It's not the sort of the covering and the concealment that it might initially suggest. Elsewhere, it's not only insufficient in its protection of the body from the outer elements, but further insufficient in ways that bring weather into the supposedly protected omnibus space. Clothing becomes the vehicle of the wet weather that can intrude further upon the passenger. And in Charles Dickens's The Bloomsbury Christening, the rather smart Mr. Dumps finds himself in a rather desperate case on a rainy day. Catching an already very full omnibus to the christening, that is the subject of the piece, he manages to squeeze himself into a seat which placed him in close contact with a passenger who had been walking about all the morning without an umbrella and who looked as if he had spent the day in a full water butt, only wetter. Here the concern is not so much the wet passenger himself, but rather his proximity to Mr. Dumps. And the author of another piece, the previously cited Will the Public Strike, likewise bemoans the wet skirts of female omnibus riders clinging to his legs as he makes his way down the central aisle. There's a threat of potential transfer of wet clothing from one passenger to the other, and for this to infiltrate through the subject's own clothing and onto the skin beneath. So through these kind of initial senses of the sense of the body being kind of acted upon and potentially sort of worked through and into by all of these different forms of intrusion, we can go back to kind of think about the skin and the self and say that if they're integrally constitutive and related to one another, there is this sort of sense of the close bound upness of the self within the skin, then the close contact of the compartment is threatening the space and the integrity and the wholeness of that skin self. More than just an unpleasant discomfort, these intrusions upon the skin press it and intrude upon the self contained within the skin layer. The omnibus was a highly visual environment, and I'm going to turn now to think about gazing and looking at skin and looking more at the visuality of the omnibus. Awareness of visuality abounded. And in his sketches by Boz, Reflection on Omnibuses, Dickens notes each person gazes through the window in front of him and everybody thinks that his opposite neighbour is staring at him. While Dickens here entertains the possibility of enjoying the view from the window, as well as gesturing towards the potential for misinterpretation that might arise in these gazing interactions, with everybody wrongly perhaps thinking that his opposite neighbour is staring at him, Margaret Rosata Nitka notes that overcrowding was the frequent feature of the omnibus and a frequent feature of omnibus narratives, and frequently the window view would indeed be obstructed, not like we see here with Joy's lovely kind of open air scene behind, but rather perhaps more so like William Egley's Omnibus Life in London, which suggests only the briefest glimpses of windows that are otherwise obscured by heads and hats. Within this very sort of cluttered and filled visual field then, in which there's little opportunity for sort of gazing out the window, the gaze of the passengers comes to occupy a significant component of the artistic scenes. Egley's overcrowded omnibus here is filled with 12 passengers clustered into the interior, 2 of whom are only visible by their hats, and a further 3 figures crowded at the back door, so as to completely occupy almost the visual field with bodies. And of these 13 visible faces, if you'll forgive my rudimentary technical skills, we can see that there's a really kind of multi-directional, confusing scene of gazing that contributes to the already confusing busy scene and its bustling textiles and textures. Many of the passengers are looking upon one another and each in a different direction to one another. So we sort of have this kind of internal conflict of gazing permeating the passage, and really sort of filling the scene with attention to the gaze and the gaze of passengers upon one another. Returning to Joy's Bayswater omnibus, the scene is somewhat more spacious with greater expanses of window visible, yet nonetheless 3 of the 6 passengers are occupied in looking at one another, the other passenger reading his newspaper, while the woman and the young girl at the far left are both staring at the baby in the woman's arms. And again, we've still got a slightly less cluttered, but still a multi-directional visual field of gazing that is drawn. Turning our own critical gaze onto these passengers, both Joy and Egley seem to very much invite our gaze onto the depiction of skin surfaces. And so despite the sort of the cluttering of the surrounds and the filling of the surrounds with all of these other features within the visual field, it's the complexion, and particularly the fair white complexion of idealized femininity in 19th century Britain, that's given striking luminosity in distinction from the rest of that visual field. So in Omnibus Life, particular emphasis is given to the fair white young woman seated just left of the centre of the visual field, face given extra luminosity in order to stand out from the more rugged, shadowy tones of the passengers. And then the woman standing in the centre of the doorway, the back similarly catches the eye for the lucid whiteness of her cheek and chin, again sort of given a reflecting light so as to bring attention to that. Among the other figures in the scene, particularly the gentlemen, there is more variety of colour and texture of skin. Their skins display the markings of age, labour and other social factors, and each of them can be disentangled further in that respect for what they're suggesting through that. At the same time, though, both this and Joy's painting are limited in depicting only white passengers, and limit the visual field in that respect. Egley's painting is more kind of varied than Joy's. If we go back to the Bayswater omnibus, the pale, clear complexioned woman second from the right is again given a special prominence through the bright lighting afforded by her upward gaze into the open doorway, as well as the resonance between her skin and the striking full white dress that stands out from the clothing of the other passengers, while the woman in the centre, whose clothing and adornments also distinguish her, is clearly very well off. She's also turning her head to show the whiteness of her neck and the lower cheek on the viewer's right, and the definition to the left of her face is afforded by light through the window, just a sort of thin sliver of light that catches her slight cheek. Nonetheless, though, the limitations of the visual field does not necessarily show sort of fully representative, and it really limits the extent to which these visual fields are constructed. Even though Egley's is a little more varied in the sort of the sense of the colours, and particularly the sort of redness that sort of abounds throughout this scene. And for transport experiences of people of colour in the 19th century, refer back again to another excellent talk that we had at the seminar last year, which was Alicia Barnes's talk on Indian travellers' experiences of the railways in particular. And that sort of opens our eyes to then the further limitations when we see the very sort of white presentation of passengers within these scenes. And that's a point I will come back to a bit later as well. So in the context of this gazing space, such close focused scrutiny on the appearance of other passengers leads in literary depictions to very interesting linguistic explorations of the skin. To give just one brief example, Edmund Yates describes an old gentleman with a face like a withered apple, a description conveying both the aging of the skin through its wrinkled appearance, as well as the sort of uneven, ruddy and irregularly coloured surface that is conjured up through this very striking depiction. Here, the skin provides a fleeting glimpse into the history of the subject, showing how skin is the body's memory of our lives. Skin remembers, skin contains and communicates history. It offers us a sense of its history and unfolding a reading through that. Yet Prosser continues that skin surface is misleading, a fabrication that is as much fiction as fact, an unreliable surface. And indeed, other writers will explore the way in which skin becomes a blank canvas in which passengers can read or misread stories of the passenger's own devising. And Wilkie Collins's Basil goes furthest in making use of the possibilities that this creates. So near the start of the work, Basil finds himself out of an idle impulse of the moment, riding an omnibus in the passage quoted briefly already, the perambulatory exhibition room. And this passage is one which leads him to observing a beautiful young woman who he immediately falls in love with. Nitka reads the passage as one in which the playful perception of the gaze, the leisurely gentleman, becomes engaged in the pleasurable pursuit of spectatorship, really highlighting this gazing space. And indeed, forms of gazing do predominate throughout the passage. He watches different people observing their gait, their varieties of human character as various as the varieties of the human face. He notes the different people that enter and sort of pauses upon gazing and observing each of them. Again, a lean, withered old man, particularly striking here, with the intrusion of his bare bald head and wrinkled forehead being wiped with a ragged blue cotton handkerchief, presumably resulting from perspiration, a skin function that's much preoccupied the Victorians, and it suggests again to us skin leaking outwards into the space around it, much to the disgust of some of the other passengers. This visuality, though, sets the scene for the entrance of a young woman, and this is the young woman who Basil will proceed to fall instantly in love with, and this becomes the driving force for the rest of the narrative. And her entrance into the carriage is striking because amid this gazing scene, we have a moment of direct contact between the passengers. And I've highlighted the relevant bits. I just didn't want to sort of cut out the surrounding context, but I'm just going to pause there for the moment of contact here in the middle. I'd helped to hand her in as she passed me, merely touching her arm for a moment, but how the sense of touch was prolonged. I felt it thrilling through me, thrilling in every nerve, in every pulsation of my fast throbbing heart. This moment of direct touch briefly enters into the compartment as an illicit, transgressive and fleeting intermission of deliberate and pleasurable body contact. Even while intermediated through the layers of clothing, the skin beneath experiences the sensation of touch pressing into that clothing, reaching through and into the body to result in the thrilling of every nerve. Collins here seems to really interestingly pull apart the physical and psychic experience of touch in the contrast and sort of deliberate contrast that forms beneath the two halves of these sentences. The moment of contact is at first merely for a moment, a touch of his hand on her arm. Yet in the next sentence, it expands from the space and time of that contact to become prolonged in time and thrilling through every nerve of his body, abounding into the wider space of his body and into the wider meanings and that it creates and reverberates throughout this passage. So while only brief and fleeting, there's a sense of the significance, the unusual nature, and the kind of rare transgression that this moment affords, and that continues to sort of play on his mind throughout the passage. Touch is prohibited, and so touching turns to gazing. As the woman sits down, moves away from his sensory experience of the touch to the visual pleasure he can gain by looking. Yet further noticeable is that this gazing plays with the obscuring and revelation, or reading and obstructed reading, of skin. As the woman enters the carriage, she's obscured by a veil, and he's only able to vaguely perceive that she was young and beautiful. Beyond this, he adds, though I might imagine much, I could see little. But at the moment in which she lifts her veil, she reveals herself and occupies his gaze even further. She was dark. Her hair, eyes, and complexion were darker than usual in English women. She has a round olive cheek and a lovely dusky throat, contrasting with the little rim of delicate white lace encircling it, and in the final paragraph. She is not, therefore, the very white, culturally idealized femininity of the visual depictions shown above, but seemingly all the more compelling to Basil for this, who is drawn to the appearance of maturity and the fire in her large dark eyes that resonate with and further add to a sense of the transgressive nature. But Basil has a sense here that he's moving outside of perhaps cultural and social norms in his attraction to her, and this indeed will continue throughout the narrative. In that attraction in different manifestations. So her veil goes back down, but the sense of the transgressive lingering gaze, prepared for it as we have been through the prolonged sensation of the transgressive touch, continues to reverberate. All this to behold in spite of the veil, he writes at the in this final paragraph. So senses just as the touch has been momentary, so the gaze has been momentary, but it can continue to reflect and influence throughout this scene. So in Basil, senses, touch, and the gaze combine here to produce a very striking experience on the omnibus. Visuality predominates, but it is an unusually embodied visuality that brings together sight and touch into this particularly striking moment. Okay, so these reflections on feminine skin take us back to the final part of this paper, in which I just want to go back now to consider the skin culture surrounding the omnibus space, and to go back to George William Joy's painting to think again about how it's presenting to us this skin image. Excuse me. So going back to this painting and Mieneke Henepi's writing on this, she comments upon the Pears soaps advertisements, which are visible above the seated passengers, and how in the urban environments there's this paradox between the abundance of soap advertisements that stress a visual healthy skin and where cleanliness loses its visibility at the same time, because the reality of modern city life for the middle classes, and particularly women, means that there's a real possibility of coming into contact with dirt, visible or invisible, throughout the journey. The fair skins of the young women run the chance of getting dirty on the trip. We've seen a multitude of possible causes for that dirt and all the things that might indeed intrude upon that in that skin and their otherwise kind of idealized presentation. Of course, advertisements were in profusion throughout the 19th century city, and much has been written on Victorian commodity culture, advertising in general, and the commercialization of skincare. And this went hand in hand, as indeed Tehenepi's article unfolds, with developments in dermatology and that growing culture of awareness of skin knowledge that I mentioned at the start. I just want to offer there a few sort of reflections that bring together these contexts into the spatial context of the omnibus as a site for these discourses to coalesce and converge. So for one thing, Ahmed reminds us, writing of contemporary skin culture, that skin care and skin maintenance is skin work, a practice that reflects our self, our well-being, our moral obligation to maintain a well-regulated skin boundary. As the always already seen by the gaze of the other, we must work at our skin if it is to reflect our well-being. The agency of the skin, its role as police force, is displaced onto the self. We must police our skin so it can police our bodies. The skin belongs to the self, and we must take care of it if we are to care for ourselves. This is not just a kind of innocuous casual culture, but a culture of skin care and skin maintenance is one that runs deeper in the 19th century, particularly with associations with morality and cleanliness and the upholding of kind of a clean and well policed and well looked after skin border presents all of those associations. Indeed, thinking about Joy's painting, we might note further that not only does it sort of present this sort of paradoxical contrast between the sort of the potential of dirt and the advertisements that promote the sort of the cleanliness and the healthy skin culture. At the same time, while the women do run the risk of getting dirty on the trip, they don't in this vision. We've noted already the perpetration of the kind of the white dresses and the very nicely sort of presented skin and the visual idealization of the skin of the women in particular in this image. So Joy's painting participates in the production and reproduction of ideas around the skin and ideas around the sort of maintaining the healthy, dirt-free, clean skin at the same time as it shows that pairs image. There's a kind of double participation in this culture going on here. Furthermore, we can note that not one but two pairs soap ads are visible, giving a kind of double reiteration again to the visual culture of skin cleanliness within the scene. It's not just a kind of innocuous presence, but a really reinforced emphasis on the soap advertisements, which particularly framed the young women in the centre, as well as sitting neatly parallel at the centre point of the upper line of the painting within our own vision. These two paintings, just to give them a bit of a close-up, are specifically an 1886 advertisement that utilised endorsements by famous actresses. I apologise, I can't find a nice coloured image we can see in this one. It was actually kind of there's some blue and some pink in the actual image itself. But that gives you a sense of the image that's being presented there. And then the one on the right is probably the most famous pairs image, Bubbles, which reworked a John Everett Millay painting into a pairs soap advertisement, bringing in the bubbles and specifically bringing in ideas around childhood, youth and innocence. So the frame that Joy creates is one that brings then these sort of two discourses together, sort of youth and innocence and women and femininity, and the kind of cosmetic and presentation of femininity. The double iteration of these images also alludes, of course, to the great profusion of pairs advertisements throughout the 19th century city. Tien Mukherjee notes in his visit to Europe, "Wherever you go where you meet with pairs soap, even pennies are marked with these magic words. How many people must have gone mad by these words being constantly presented before their eyes? Mr. Pear certainly deserves an extensive sale of his soap, not only in the railway stations and carriages, but wherever you go, you meet with advertisements. Walls, sandwich boys, omnibuses, steamboats, they are everywhere." So Pear's soap percolates throughout the visual sphere of the city. And Anne Cronin writes on a contemporary city in an essay that also reflects on 19th century advertising and urban culture. that outdoor advertising forms part of what our site stumbles over in the busy visual clutter of contemporary cities. As part of a broader sensory regime, space and site articulate to produce the lived city, and it's this relationship that is both influenced by and acts to constitute advertising's commercial aesthetics of mobility. Pear's soap in Mukherjee's reflection seems to have its own distinct and ubiquitous sensory regime throughout the city, articulating the lived city as a Pear's city. Amid these other venues, though, where the advert is seen, and this whole array of sort of context that he notes, seeing it within, it might be argued that among these space-making practices of the city, the omnibus affords a particularly close contact in the spatial proximity that it brings between viewer and advert. While sandwich boards and walls circulate past as this part of kind of moving panorama of city life, in the omnibus interior, images are not just constantly presented before the eyes, but rather are static and persistent in the visual field for however long the journey is. Of course, the traveller can look away, perhaps to gaze upon other skin and to reflect upon we do as the contrast between soap and skin, but there's still a sense of the restriction of the visual field that gives further significance to the omnibus and the space and time that it presents as the space in which these images are presented. Not only are skincare practices skin work, as Ahmed has suggested, but the maintenance of social cultural ideals as presented in the body bears one further consideration in the context of the Pear's soap advert. Just before this section in Mukherjee's passage, he notes or alludes to, rather than sort of directly confronting, but he alludes to the racist history of Pear's soap advertisements. Mukherjee here notes the black races need no longer have the fear of being eaten up by white men for the sake of their complexion, for a single application of Mr. Pear's soap will whiten the blackest of black faces. He refers here to Pear's adverts in which a black child is shown having his body washed, and his body is washed white, while his face is depicted as black. And there's a visual entangling of cleanliness, whiteness, and Victorian morality discourse that has been discussed by scholars such as Anne McClintock in Imperial Leather, looking at the convergence of race, colonialism, and commodity culture, and the ways in which soap played a part in these regimes, specifically through adverts such as the Pear's soap adverts, which directly entangle and reiterate these racist associations between cleanliness, whiteness, and morality. Bringing this back to the omnibus space, the potential of Pear's soap advertisements to be this particular advertisement, and we don't see it in paintings, but Mukherjee suggests it was, of course, widely circulated and much seen himself. In the space of the omnibus, it would serve to reinforce a culture of racism and racial exclusion that extends more widely in both directions, both into the sphere of skin care, and the handling and discussion of race in dermatology that I'm currently exploring elsewhere, as well as extending into the spaces of mobility and the discursive construction in the 19th century and indeed beyond, of racial exclusion and racist discourses playing out within spaces of mobility. Taking us back to then again and bringing a further layer to the predominance of those white idealized skins that we've seen already. At the same time as these discourses expand out of the omnibus, they come back and compact and compress within the particularly close confines that the viewer passenger would be presented with. So advertising is another confrontation with cultures of skin and the cultural messaging of skin, thinking about what it means to view skincare, skin adverts, and the cultural messaging put forward within these spaces of travel and other mobile spaces beyond as well. So to conclude, amid a range of sensory explorations, the skin presents an intriguing mode for thinking about the socio-corporeal dimension of travel, the experience of passengers in the enclosure of the omnibus space. In the context of 19th century skin cultures, skin provides a lens for writers to reflect upon visuality, proximity, and contact in dialogue with wider socio-cultural contexts that come into contact with one another in the close confines of the omnibus compartment. In skin, we find a site through which public space might press in upon the private individual body, as well as which social space and other passengers might press in upon it as well, touching through and into the skin, situated within and at the centre of the omnibus, as well as a site through which the body becomes part of the spectacle and the sensing of the public space to others, and which extends beyond into a wider skin culture that contextualizes, makes meaning of, and gives meaning to the skin as it is presented within the omnibus. Overall, the public space of the omnibus brings us into close contact with ideas about how we move through, interact with, and leave behind spaces of public transport that extend not only to this discussion, but also possibly to other contexts as well. Thank you very much.